Can you hear me? Hello. How does it sound? Good? Okay. Thank you so much, Ash, for inviting me, and thank you all so much for coming out. This is such a special place, and I feel really honored to get to talk about this here. I haven't really talked about Tasteslop in meat space before. I haven't really talked about it that much. I've chatted with a lot of friends about it, which is how the original piece of writing came to be. But this is a work in progress. It is a developing thought, and it's something that I am excited to share with you today. I think what am I hearing?
There's a little bit of static.
Okay, no worries.
Can you try a different mic too, maybe?
Yeah.
Test.
Okay.
It's a performance art piece.
Ooh.
Okay, try again.
How's this? Better? Okay. Okay, Tasteslop is a work in progress, and I'm going to talk about it tonight here for the first time ever. Welcome. I'm Emily. I founded Nemesis. We are a consulting firm, and we publish cultural analysis on Substack and elsewhere. And sometimes I forecast trends. Maybe Tasteslop is a trend that I forecasted, or maybe it's something else altogether. And I want to start with the feeling of what it felt like when this idea started. So before there was ever Tasteslop, taste was already becoming an almost unbearable discursive meme. And it was becoming one of those terms that you immediately wanted to not be hearing about it when people were talking about it. And I think that's really interesting when that happens. Back in the day when my trend forecasting group, K-Hole, popularized the term normcore, arguably it was hitting a similar note, and quite notably to us, someone made a Chrome extension that blocked any example of it from showing up in your browser. And that's sort of how I felt about taste discourse, especially tech world or tech adjacent taste discourse, when all of this was bubbling up. And so that phenomenon of the unbearable repetition of an annoying idea is where we're beginning today. So there's something just interesting about these themes and buzzwords that really make you want to lay down and die. And the question for us to reflect on today is both simple and not so simple. So when one of these discursive memes is intolerable, we should really be asking ourselves, what are they hiding? And my argument here, which I will get into a little bit later, is that it is true cultural anxiety. And so while taste might be annoying and overdone, true cultural anxiety never gets old, for me at least. But let's just be clear. It would be a lie to say that Tasteslop was completely organic. It was absolutely contrived, like so many other things are these days. So ever since the era of normcore, I was aware that a certain type of magic happens when you are able to construct a completely oxymoronic phrase, or word, or compound. So if you can put something together that kind of completely cancels itself out, like norm and core, or taste and slop, it starts to trigger a bunch of interesting responses out in the world. And I've had my eye out for opportunities to do that ever since. So this, absolutely was as contrived and as pre-cooked as anything else you might encounter these days, just to be totally clear. And don't worry, I am completely aware that the concept of coinage itself is somewhat cursed, and that people put the words taste and slop together before I did. So these are a couple of examples from January, and I first posted about it in February, just to be clear. But I put those words together here responding to this particular image, and that was rather organic. So the image that you're seeing here is an AI-generated mood board that includes items such as a Remova aluminum suitcase, a skinny-necked kettle. I own both of, well, I don't own an aluminum Remova. I have a kind of shitty plastic one. A Dieter Rams book, which I do not have, and then a shirt with a kind of mood board on the back, a tote bag, and sort of like nods at graphic design. So this is kind of a perfect example. Okay, this might be even better. We're just getting better and better. This was a perfect example of an idea that was emerging through this kind of irritation around the recurring idea of taste about what was going on when things that were considered to be tasteful and had some sort of cultural or historical resonance with the idea of good taste were meeting more and more AI-generated content and were finding their way into slop. And so based on that image, I started to put together a theory of Tasteslop and try to systematize backwards just what I had pointed out. So the first definition of Tasteslop is very simple. It's slop made out of things considered to be tasteful. So that one is relatively obvious. Related, but a little bit different, is what some have called taste washing, but is more like tasteful things deployed in service of slop. So like a very tasteful dinner to promote a slop creation tool. I also argued that like pitching your sass and Evan Kenori was a tasteful thing deployed in service of slop. Sort of like a veneer of something putatively tasteful with slop as the ultimate goal. And then the third one, and this is where this whole kind of question of Tasteslop starts to really eat itself, is recurrent tech discourse about the significance of taste. So this discourse circles around a few themes. It is kind of about how important taste is. It's kind of about the question of whether AI or agents can have taste. It's kind of about whether humans having taste is one of the last meaningful moats against total automation, and if so, what that will look like. But then some lords also argue that AI itself does have great taste. And there's something very telling about this, how it's kind of like split on both sides. Like there isn't necessarily, the significance is clear, but the positions kind of keep revolving. So as I got more and more interested in Tasteslop, I started querying the experts in my life. And this is a text message with Michael Rock, who is a branding expert and legendary designer from the Studio 2x4 in New York. And I was asking him about this question of basically whether AI can have taste. And he went to Bourdieu, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute, and saying that if you're just following this definition of taste classifies and it classifies the classifier, it seems like an agent could approximate that. But then he said it's basically trickier to like do what he's calling a judo move where bad taste is reworked as a signifier of refinement, which is basically camp, which we'll get to in a minute. So the question is, can machines be legitimately camp? Can AI be true camp? I think this show is an amazing probe into that idea as well. There's a lot of camp, kitsch, and the other all around us. So that's something that we can also reflect on. So Michael Rock's talking about this book. This was one of those books that I had lied about reading for so many years that by the time I actually read it, I was like, damn, I should have read this a long time ago. But basically, the idea here, quite simply, is that establishing taste is always about establishing a hierarchy. So the person who gets to say this is in good taste or this is in bad taste is the one that's in power, or the social group that gets to determine that is the one that's in power. That's a very like simplistic boiling down. of it, but that is basically the idea. And then there are tons of very interesting, there are tons of very interesting French examples that are quite nuanced about like, if you're a lawyer, what rug you have and what that means in the world of this book, but you don't need to know those exact examples to understand the principle. And so I started to riff on this idea in order to understand what Tasteslop really is and what it might mean. And so if we're starting with the idea that taste classifies and classifies the classifier, Tasteslop is what happens when the classifying function is automated, overly explicit, or reduced to spitting out rote taste tokens. So when I say rote taste tokens, I mean like the Ramova suitcase as this token of taste that's just getting kind of thrown willy-nilly into a random context to signify taste without actually doing the work of signifying taste, which is a social phenomenon. More on that in a moment. But something that doesn't often happen in this irritating taste discourse is like an actual definition of where real good taste comes from. So I'm not too shy to do that, and I will just do that first to help kind of set the table stakes here. So it really has three parts. We're starting with discernment. You have to be able to tell one thing from the other and have a reason why you like something more than something else that is specific. This sounds very basic, but you would be shocked how many people can't do this. Then there's what I'm summing up as pattern recognition, which means you have to have some awareness of what came before you. That can be like actual history, that can be pop culture history, that can be the history of your environment or your family or your own cognition, but you have to be able to have a sense of what came before and understand what's coming next. And people with truly good taste have some degree of intuition about this and can sense what rhymes with the past, what might feel really refreshing when it comes up in a new way, and that's the mystical part. And that part is hard to reduce. We'll also return to that. And then the third element here is idiosyncrasy. And when I say idiosyncrasy, I'm really thinking about the people in my life who have good taste. They have very idiosyncratic personal reasons for why they love what they love, even if that thing is kind of generic. And that's the thing. We live in a sea of artificiality and mass-produced objects. Not everything needs to be totally unique and refined in order to be a sign of good taste. In fact, the whole kind of phenomenon of camp in the world is about finding ways to celebrate artificiality, but in an esoteric and idiosyncratic way. And I see that among the people in my life who have good taste. And basically, idiosyncrasy is a way of making something, even something normal in your life, have a sort of esoteric charge, and esotericism is important. But the biggest thing that people are missing is that taste must be socially validated. So there's no such thing as taste in a forest. There's no such thing as taste that's totally just contained in one object. Anything could be tasteful, or anything could be totally meaningless and blah, depending by the route which it arrives. And my former collaborator, Greg Fong from K-Hole, really focuses on this idea that really good taste understands like really what he calls what's the most refreshing. This idea of what's refreshing keeps coming back. And we know, it goes without saying, that copying and pasting what you think is good taste is bad taste. So this is what happens when things that started out as being iconic for some reason, rare, desirable, probably expensive, either literally expensive or expensive because of the time or the effort or the friction that it took to get to know them, become vulgar and chuggy over time. And there's something odd about that that I think is the Tasteslop uncanny. So what's underneath all of this is a void. There's like an essential nothingness underlying any particularly tasteful item. And there's something about this like the coming together of taste and slop that is sort of moving the boundaries around taste in a way that is making everything feel kind of blurry and uncanny. And I think that's also one of the questions that this show today at Tiat is getting into. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the cultural history that brought us here. What we're talking about today, in a lot of ways, has to do with the question of differentiation. And differentiation is, of course, a marketing idea, but it's super important to the way that subculture has become mass. And in the hipster era, being super different made something relevant. That is the simple formula. And then what started to happen is the cliche that all hipsters thought they were so different, but they were actually the same. So this is kind of the exactitudes vibe of hipster culture. And any of us who were around in that era can probably attest that that was in fact the case. And so when my old group K-hole started to think about normcore, it was an attempt to think our way out of this predicament, this idea that you needed to prove how cool you are by having the most esoteric and specifically guarded interests that no one else had. And we started to try and come up with a version of being cool that had to do with being as slippery and multiple as possible and being able to do the most code switching and like slip into as many different environments as possible. That got kind of eaten up by the difference machine again and became like Jerry Seinfeld style. And then there was kind of this infinite ZERP era production of more and more difference with like a degrading material basis that became the scenario we were describing in our memo, the umami theory of value. So without going too far into the umami theory of value, that was all about kind of calling the top of that endlessly produced, untrackable, undifferentiated difference when there were so many confusing little differences that everything started to seem meaningless. And Tasteslop, I guess, is what happens after the collapse, when it's basically free to make something differentiated, but it doesn't seem to mean much. So, okay, let's like go through a couple of examples of Tasteslop and think about whether they are Tasteslop or not. Because I mentioned tabbies, there was like a big conversation online about whether tabbies were Tasteslop, and I would just like to say once and for all, of course, like Margiela tabbies are not in and of themselves Tasteslop. Like they could be a part of Tasteslop. They are the type of thing that is highly susceptible to showing up in a Tasteslop situation. But tabbies themselves, especially like historical tabbies, like the fact of a split toe shoe is certainly not Tasteslop. I would say that this distressed Amazon tabby sneaker is more of a Tasteslop item if I had a gun to my head. Oh, sorry. No worries.
What happened?
We're back? We're so back, okay. This is International Art English. I don't know how many of you have encountered International Art English, but it used to be all around us in these types of settings. And this is sort of the example of how you could have a version of Tasteslop where basically like big art, culture, and theory words showed up in all sorts of press releases to try and make something that was sort of formulaic and generic seem tasteful and significant. Then, the Remova is also a big topic. So I would say the salsa air on the left here is not Tasteslop, but the new Remova is Tasteslop, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Duchamp was actually very interested in taste. So this question of whether or not taste is at play in selecting an item is kind of quite essential to art history, in that it was part of Duchamp's thinking about the ready-made. So to him, the ready-made was something selected in the complete absence of good or bad taste. So is a ready-made Tasteslop something for you to ponder? I would say sporty and rich is like a great example of Tasteslop. So Margiela tabby's not Tasteslop, sporty and rich Tasteslop, and then my Daruti column radio, which is great, is Tasteslop for sure. Okay, So those are a few examples. And like this, I'm kind of joking and I'm kind of not. None of these things in and of themselves are really necessarily taste slop. It's always contextual, but then it also feels ridiculous to like make this kind of oxymoronic meme and then insist on people understanding context, because those things don't really fit together. But for the sake of today's talk, where we're really getting into it, those are a few different ways of how I look at it personally. Okay, so what is happening when everything is getting, oops. Should we switch it? Can I also have a tissue? Thank you. When everything is getting sloptimized is something like a lack of tension. And in the umami theory of value, we talked about how paradox is kind of at the heart of contemporary consumption. You're like, I shouldn't be here, but I am. I don't know what this is, but I feel like I should. This doesn't make sense, but I love it. And as we've kind of like ramped up the production of that paradoxical tension, perfect, thank you, love. We're also now in this place where there's like there's a real lack of tension in a lot of what we're consuming culturally. So lack of tension leads to lack of esotericism, and esotericism is an important ingredient in good taste in the age of mass artificiality. So that's where we're gonna go back to this idea of camp. So camp is well theorized by Susan Sontag, 1964, in Notes on Camp. And I just wanna like think for a second about what was going on when she wrote that. So she was 31, it was 1964. There was a wealthier post-war America where there was all of a sudden this relationship between high and low culture, where low culture or mass-produced culture was starting to become sexier and feel more aesthetically legitimate. And there were important gay influences that were obviously not mainstream, but were definitely influencing the way that people interpreted culture. And this essay that she wrote, Notes on Camp, started to theorize that. So camp really needs esotericism and artificiality to function. It's a way of basically looking at anything that crosses your path and being able to determine what might make it interesting. And all you need is one other person who kind of gets it, and that's it. So it's kind of this endlessly reproducible, totally emergent, like grassroots way of looking at the world, where you can have a form of good taste that can operate totally free from any like conventional forms of refinement. And that's very important for the moment that we're in. So Sontag talks about camp as a sensibility that converts the serious into the frivolous. So she means like, you can take the most frivolous, dumb, silly, artificial thing, and kind of like the sillier and dumber, the grosser it might be, the more you might find something fabulous to enjoy in it. And if you have a really good reason why, if you have that discernment, if you have that idiosyncratic perspective, if you're smart enough and cunty enough, you can kind of communicate why that's camp. That's what she's talking about. And Tasteslop, by contrast, converts the frivolous into the serious. So there's like something really like heavy and leaden and boring. This is like, we get back to the like, oh my God, you're talking about taste again. I want to kill myself. Like, so what makes it serious is both its like kind of like leaden quality, but also that it is revealing this deeper issue at play, which is like a very serious form of cultural anxiety around taste. So briefly, let's distinguish fear, which is from a specific threat, from anxiety, which is non-specific. And what's actually funny is that if you go way back to like 18th century ideas around taste, the like flighty and non-specific nature of it has been around for a long time. So there's something about taste that is fundamentally non-specific and fundamentally anxiety-provoking. And maybe if we see it through the Bourdieu lens in the 80s, we start to see that it really is about the anxiety of the hierarchy and who can say what's important. In our old K-hole report, we talked about how the job of the advanced consumer is managing anxiety, period. But now we're starting to see that anxiety spread to not just the consumers, but also the producers of culture. So my real thought about this is that this surging obsession with taste is not really about aesthetics or like what's cool or what's nice. It's about whether you can really get the cultural resonance and distribution necessary for new forms of technology, which depends on whether people think it works for them or makes sense for them. And it's impossible to completely control that, which is actually a really good thing. So it's a deep anxiety about whether economic capital can fully capture cultural capital at the exact moment that cultural capital is more important than ever. And I love this for us. I actually think that this is a really good situation to be in as everything is changing so much. Because new cultural capital, new forms of taste, new forms of understanding can be created at any moment, here, now, whenever, wherever. All you need are two people, a thought, and a knowing look. And it's pretty hard to control that or prevent that from happening. So the world is our oyster. Those are my thoughts on Tasteslop. Thank you so much for being here with me to talk about it today. These are some ways to keep in touch with me or read more of my writing, and I would love if you did. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? We're going to move into the Q&A. Is this loud or not? I can't tell.
I can hear you. Hi.
Two kind of interrelated thoughts, and I'm curious what you think about this. The first one is, the taste is obviously a sense, right? It's obviously something that you kind of need a body, arguably, I guess. I guess this is really up for debate now, but historically you've needed a body to taste things and to discern whether they should be consumed, to discern when they should be consumed, talking literally and figuratively, obviously. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how, I think that a big part of what's happening right now is that people are kind of believing that bodies don't matter, that we don't need bodies, and that embodied information doesn't matter, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that. The other question, I'm going to try to make it quick, is that another person's writing on tact, Katja Haustein, she talks about how tact and taste are very similar words, right? And both like sensory, they both have to do with gaining sensory information and how we treat, in the case of tact, how we treat other people, and how we remember that they have bodies and that they should be respected in physical space, right? So I'm wondering how much you feel, or what thoughts you have about like taste as more when it comes to how we treat other people and like politeness and that kind of thing.
I don't know if I have a lot of thoughts about the politeness part per se, but what your question made me think of is something that I actually wish I had gone into a little bit more detail in this talk today about, which is that so first of all, I don't think that taste, the way I'm talking about it, is not the same thing as taste in your mouth. Let's just start there. I'm talking about like taste more in the sense of, I think can you hear me? Okay. More in the taste of like a cultural sensibility. But the thing is, you definitely don't need a body or to be real or to be a human to do that. It's just that having good taste might have a different function or not function the way that we think of it. So if we're accustomed to thinking of good taste as this sort of socially validated human phenomenon, and if it is happening by non-humans, it will function differently and mean something different. So that's what your comment made me think of, which is an important point that I should have probably made in here today, so I really appreciate you bringing that up.
I had a question, if you don't mind talking a little bit more about the umami theory.
Yeah.
Or the value. I think I read that a long time ago, but you said like umami is like the beginning of the end of the experience economy, and I was just curious if you had an opinion on like if Tasteslop is kind of or if umami is the precursor to Tasteslop, like what are the like implications of culture and like the economy?
So, okay, I'll try my best because there's like a bunch of stuff there. I really appreciate you bringing that up. So, the umami theory of value was inspired by this visit in 2019 to a restaurant in New York that served these like French dip sandwiches that were incredibly savory and also served these massive pieces of cake that were very Instagrammable and had this sort of cognac colored light. And at the time, we'd been doing research at Nemesis for MTV on why young people weren't having sex anymore. This kind of before this became like a huge thing, like they were noticing, basically in MTV's focus groups, they were learning that young people weren't having sex anymore. And they were like, we can't really ask them about that, but like, can you tell us what you think is going on? It was a very interesting and disturbing project. And I was in that restaurant in New York, and I texted Marty, my co-founder, people no longer want sex, they want umami. And so, like many things in our practice, what started out as an inside joke became this kind of like look into culture around that idea. And it's actually my friend Michele, who's here, who is Italian, would also often say of American food that it was too tasty. And I would always think about that, because also the idea really was about culture becoming too tasty, like kind of trying to load up this sense of meaning that comes from a contradiction. So like umami can give like umami intensifiers in food make things taste more savory no matter what, and it's also very connected to like gentrification. Basically, this is a whole longer conversation. But as it became cheaper and cheaper to produce new things in this ZERP era, umami became the principle for giving you the feeling that something important was happening. And when we put out that memo, it was like right at the beginning of COVID lockdown, so we were predicting that like the experience economy as we knew it would really die down. I think we were kind of wrong about that particular part, but in terms of like there being more and more difference that means less and less, that phenomenon is very much the precursor of Tasteslop. And I think what makes it, I can't make a whole prediction about it for the economy in general, but I think what makes it tricky, both tricky and amazing as like an enjoyer of culture, is that it makes it harder to find the things that resonate with you, but it also, I think, creates more room for that at the same time. So those are the forces that I'm kind of wrestling with. I know it's quite vague how I'm ending it there, but my thoughts about it are still being developed.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot of people in this room. I think I really, really appreciated what you were saying about discernment specifically, and the ability to have this idea of provenance and knowing where things came from. And I think, hopefully, a lot of people here have existed in the world before hyper-realistic generative AI has kind of distributed across our online ecosystems and become very pervasive. So there's kind of been time for people to build a point of view or taste, or when they see generated images, kind of have an intuition of where those images came from. But I wonder how you think this is going to affect people who are entering online ecosystems right now in an age where they're exposed to all of these images, not knowing what's true, what's not. They're kind of more divorced from where things came from, and how that's going to shape how people build their own personal tastes going forward.
I think that people will just kind of like develop new ways to sense what's real. This is a highly unscientific prediction, obviously. I think that if you can't get it visually, you will either socially geolocate it or you will vibe it out in some other way. That is my prediction, I guess, if you could call it that. And you know, what's funny about the whole like provenance thing is that it goes both ways. Like we see a lot of provenance standing in for taste, like all of the like celebrity dressing that's like an archival pull or riffing off of a celebrity's 90s moment. Like many of those are like not giving anything, you know, and are using this kind of archival consciousness to stand in for good taste. So maybe that's an example of Tasteslop too. It's just one ingredient, you know, and when you see it done really well, you know that that's a part of it. And it doesn't have to be like archival in the sense of like real history either, although often people with really good taste have know something about that in my life. It could also just be like raw pattern recognition of the world that you're in, but you need some information about the past and the future and where you stand in all of it.
Hi, Emily.
Hello.
If I'm the head of brand for the Canvas tabbies, and I've been dubbed Tasteslop,
Yeah.
how do I get out of it?
That's such a good question. If I've been dubbed, well, okay. What my friend said about Tasteslop, and I do think this is kind of like the point of these very oxymoronic terms, or one of the reasons that they travel the way that they do, is that they're like fundamentally not final. So like there's something about it, I'm not gonna pretend to understand exactly how this works, I'm kind of learning as I go, where I think there's part of the reason why it's fun to talk about is that it isn't like a final designation. You could always argue the other side. Like someone can call something Tasteslop, someone could call the fact of calling it that Tasteslop, someone could, there's always another turn of the screw. And I actually don't think that just it affixes that well onto like these individual items completely. What I do think will be interesting to see is like, especially with fashion, like we're really in this time where you can quickly find like almost anything formally. So you need to figure out what it means in a different place. And that's getting more and more obscure because there's so much niche material. So that's a big question as things kind of continue, and I'm curious to see what happens.
Hey.
Hi.
Thank you. This was awesome. A question about what are the cultural conditions that make it so that this is taking like a cake that basically takes volume. But like you mentioned camp, and camp feels the reason why camp came about maybe is because the era was was full of irony and rebellious to some extent, and so this new form of cultural critique just took on and took. And so, what is it? What are the cultural conditions that make it so that are conducive to Tasteslop today?
What? Well, I don't know if I think that it was irony and rebelliousness necessarily. I think, it has to do with like the camp in the 60s, I think had to do with an interplay of high and low culture. And I think that we're at an extreme point of the interplay of high and low culture. And being in an art gallery that is trying to understand and philosophize around slop, or like look at the things that we think of as the most kind of like debased, automated versions of what technology can produce, and then look at them as an art form, is an incredible coming together of high and low. And I think that we're all feeling this moment that's becoming a long moment of transition where like, is it something like future shock? Is it something like future nausea? Is it a different thing altogether where we know everything is changing? We know our media landscape is completely changing. We see the economy continue to kind of like consolidate and fall apart at the same time. And we know there's like a lot of possibility and a lot of possibility being foreclosed on at the same time. So it's like, that's where we're at. It's like an extreme version of high and low. It's not the most fun version of high and low. It's kind of like, it's a little bit sick, sad world, but I also think there's room to maneuver. So I guess that's what I'm thinking about.
Hi. Something that you guys wrote in a People report maybe over 10 years ago has stayed with me and it's become my Roman Empire. I think I've thought about it every few months since then, and that's we live in mass indie times.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that since then, that's become the status quo, and in a way, Tasteslop is the somehow end point of that. So considering that, it feels that we go from niche to mass market in anything in a matter of few months, a year. Do you think taste should go back to being gatekept in a way? Can we go back to gatekeeping things?
I love that you brought up mass indie because that really is at the heart of this, and I'll tell you more about how that came to be in a second. But like, you don't have taste is gatekept by definition. Like, taste is in a couple of people feeling something about something else, and that is fundamentally. It's not completely private because I think you need to socially validate it with at least one other person, but it is a fundamentally like limited and gate-kept thing, you know? And I think that like the idea of gatekeeping where it's like, I'm not gonna tell you who made my shoes is not really like the point, you know? I think that for a long time there was an idea, and I still really love, if we're talking about clothes, I still love things that are very ambiguous because they do that without having to do it, but that's also played out and corny in its own way, you know what I mean? So I can call myself out on, and that's kind of like a retro thing. Mass indie came from the period where the ideas for that report were coming together, so this was 2012, 2013, I was living in New York working at Wolf Olin's branding agency, and one of the other members of K-Hole also worked there. And we were working on a branding project for Refinery 29. And the idea of mass indie was like something that I put in a deck for Refinery 29, and then I got kicked off of the Refinery 29 projects I was being insubordinate. I forgot what I was doing. I was like in a bad mood about it. But a friend had also just been to Japan and was talking about seeing like girls in very distinct subcultures, like, or subcultural outfits, like one next to another. And basically mass indie was my way of translating philosophies of neoliberalism into everyday, more pop cultural language. So a mainstream that was made up of indie subcultural niches is sort of the translation of a neoliberal situation. And we are at some breaking point of that neoliberal situation, and I don't think we really know where we are yet. So I agree that Tasteslop is kind of the end point of that. That was what I'm reaching toward with this sort of hipster, normcore, umami Tasteslop. Here we can go back to that like little timeline, which is not quite right. But yeah, mass indie times is basically the pop culture translation or everyday language translation of what it means to kind of be in a neoliberal world. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Hi, Emily.
Where am I looking? Oh, hello, hi.
Building on the gatekeeping, taste is highly dependable on a certain sophistication from an audience, right? I guess that's
Yeah.
the ultimate key. Friend Leibowitz said this very interesting thing, I'm sure you're familiar, because when
AIDS happened, we killed a large sect of a very smart, sophisticated audience.
Totally.
Do you think we are leaning towards building audiences like that, but more in a niche way, or that's one of the difficulties?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why the conversations around taste that are coming from like the parts of the tech world, especially in and around SF, that seem so disconnected from culture, like why they fall flat and are very cringy, because you get the sense that like the people who are talking about taste have no frame of reference for any sophisticated take on any culture, basically, and that's the irony. So totally, I mean, I think there's so much sophistication out there in the world, but to bring it to like another idea that we've written about a lot at Nemesis, this idea of max pain, it's like when everyone gets smarter and sophisticated, everything gets harder and more complicated too. So it's like, it's not so straightforward, but yeah.
Hey, Epson Talk. I want to try to understand what you're saying about esotericism.
Yeah.
And how that relates to taste. Because I can think of esotericism being like a way you could describe someone who just shares a bunch of math equations on Instagram, right? Or maybe the SF billboards that you see where they have very esoteric terminal commands for AI engineers. But is that tasteful? I can also, imagine much more traditionally artistic esotericism and symbolism, but where do you draw the line? Because I don't think esotericism is sufficient for your taste.
No, totally. So those are more like examples of the principle, and the point that I'm trying to make there is more that if something is completely obvious and clear and everyone gets it, it's further away from being good taste. Like it's more about the hiddenness. So it doesn't have to be at an extreme of esotericism, and arguably if it's so esoteric that nobody gets it, it's also missing the mark. And it doesn't need to be like something that we historically think of it doesn't need to be like in the back of a crystal shop or at the bottom of an equation per se. Those are more just examples of things that we could call esoteric. I think that like you can have an esoteric relationship to a t-shirt, and I know a lot of people do. But it has to do more with whatever it is that you're working with in this scenario, not just being like completely obvious and vulgar. That's what I was going for there. But I appreciate the billboards are definitely crazy, and you always think they're kind of like, people are kind of overstating it when you're not here. Then you come here and you're like, this is really interesting. And what it makes you think about is that like, advertising for us like stood in for the idea of the public, for better or for worse. Like it's not really like a great political thing necessarily, but then you see that being dispensed of, where it's like we can't even get Don Draper's Coca-Cola ad here. We just have this like random equation that's only relevant to this tiny group of people. And I think it's kind of scares us because it shows that our 20th century sense of the public through advertising, which was itself a problematic idea, is like something that's already in the bygone era. So that's my take on the billboard question. Maybe we can have one more question.
I have the last question.
Okay, great.
Let's go. Great job. This is sort of a hypothetical, I suppose. Let's say you were approached by a VC or something, and they were like, we want you to teach taste to AI, taste to agents.
Yeah.
Maybe that's happened. But, what probability would you assign like doing that successfully? Sounds like, based on the chat, not very high. And then also, what would you do if they somehow convinced you to take that job?
So I think you actually can completely do it successfully. I just don't think it has the function of taste as we know it. So it's like, you could totally have something, you could totally automate versions of good taste. Like a really stupid example of this, which is in the Tasteslop essay, is like, let's say you had an agent like find like amazing off the beaten path restaurants, and what if they were all really great? Wouldn't you say that it has good taste? Like this is like a very, very like elementary example, and it's like maybe, but it's not the same thing as having good taste among humans. It's not like it's not creating like a connection or knowing or a sense of belonging or a location in the same way. So it's just doing something else. So it's like you can totally do it. It just will have another function, and maybe those functions will be really interesting. I don't necessarily think that they will be bad. And like you could totally imagine also thinking that you're interacting with a human and not interacting with a human and having that experience of recognition. I think that's also possible. I just think it's a little different than doing it with a human. But I don't necessarily even think it's bad per se. It's just something else. So I wish I could be more specific about what that something else is, and maybe if I'm lucky enough to be back here in a year talking about this, we can kind of review our notes on what's happened, and hopefully a lot of things will actually happen instead of nothing happening. I would prefer that, I think, although maybe famous last words. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but it basically, the TLDR there is that like you can automate taste, but then what it does is very different than taste as we know it. So that's that. Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. These are such great questions. Thank you, Ash, for inviting me. How great is Tiat? Big round of applause, extra round of applause for Ash and all the hard work she does, putting all this together, so much programming. So amazing. Really appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yay.
I just wanted to announce some other things happening in this space. Tomorrow's our last day of the Epistemologies of Slop show, and so we've got a computational performance by Halim at 2 p.m. in the space. We'll have our closing reception at 3 p.m. featuring a slop bar and some mukbang installation. Come through. And then finishing off tomorrow with another lecture from Ruby on new aesthetics. Join us.
Yay.
And then we've been doing group exhibitions in this space today and experimenting with a solo show opening next Thursday for Jabal Lee on biohacking, womanhood, and AI embodiment. We'd love to have you join us. But yeah, if you took any photos, please tag us. We're at tiat.place on Instagram. Thank you for coming, and I hope you have a nice day.
Yay.